Chapter 10. Memories. From the expression on your face, things didn't go well? Naruto frowned as Shikamaru literally collapsed into the chair across from his desk. Just thinking that it was his desk was rather strange, especially considering they moved their camp every couple of weeks. But they always made sure he had a desk to use. It's so troublesome. You say that after every mission, Naruto ground out. True. Though this one was more troublesome than most. We lost that Tsuchikage and… Shikamaru let out a deep breath, his face scrunched up in anguish. I'm sorry, but we also lost Gaara. Feeling like Shikamaru's words were like a punch to the gut, Naruto's original instinct was to blow up in a rage. But he immediately clamped down on that urge, remembering they were in a war. Gaara had volunteered to go and assured him that they'd get the mission done, no matter what. Naruto had already lost so many ninja and continued to lose them in small amounts on weekly and sometimes even a daily basis. Both he and Shikamaru were close to the red-haired Kazekage, and his loss impacted them both deeply. The blonde settled for rubbing his forehead and letting out a sigh. Report. We arrived at the location just at sunrise, with no encounters, Shikamaru began to explain without hesitation, as if he wanted to get the story off his chest as soon as possible. We managed to move swiftly with a smaller group. It was only a recon mission, but Gaara thought the presence in the obelisk was familiar, so he requested that he be allowed to investigate. We voted within the group and decided it would be a good idea for him to check. He approached the obelisk and placed his hand on it. He claimed he could feel the Achibi in the obelisk and it was responding to him. He was going to attempt to remove it. But then Toby struck. I don't know how he found us, but I'm pretty sure he has some sort of detection ward or seal set up around the obelisk that none of us noticed. Instinct told me we would be walking into the trap, but I felt freeing a Biju would be worth the risk. So did everyone else. Toby appeared out of nowhere like he usually does and used one of those artifacts he has to cut Gaara, then warped him out of the area so we couldn't heal him. Before anyone could really do anything, Gaara was already gone, and it wasn't long after that when I noticed we were surrounded. I informed Tsuchikage-sama, and he told me to run back with as many people as I could while he held them off. We could still hear the sound of fighting miles away. Naruto leaned back in his chair as he listened to all of the report. How many made it back? 17 out of the 25. Better than I was expecting for coming under attack by Toby directly. We lost 2 on the way back because of the moon. Naruto was quiet for a moment but then shook his head. Not good to hear, but still better than I expected. Toby must have been preoccupied to let that many of you get away. Not that I'm not thankful because I am, it's just something that doesn't happen when he involves himself directly. The two of them sat in companionable silence before Naruto stretched in his chair, then looked at Shikamaru. The other boy was leaning back completely in the chair, eyes closed. He actually looked completely worn out for a change, instead of just being lazy. Shikamaru, go get some rest. Tell one of the guys to send a message to Kakashi and Darui, I need to talk to them. When you're more awake, tell me as much as you can about these obelisks. The other boy literally rolled out of his chair as he turned and headed for the exit. You got it, Naruto. See ya. The blonde watched as his old friend left the command tent. What he wouldn't give to have paperwork as his enemy right now, instead of the current hell they were in. Meanwhile in the past. Naruto stifled a yawn as he went over some of the reports he was charged with looking over in his capacity as overseer of the new arrivals, which had kept him incredibly busy. He had to greet all of the new visitors whenever there was a large group and either help them get set up or to meet up with the rest of their clan. Others needed to be directed to real estate brokers, construction and immigration offices, the academy and ninja registration buildings, among other places. There wasn't anything that grabbed his attention, so he set the papers down and looked out the window of his office. He had been granted a room to use in the administration building, just a few levels below the Hokage's office. It made sense in the long run, this way he wouldn't have to make the trek from his apartment when something came up with the clans and he was needed. Leaning forward and resting his head on his hand, he looked to the side, out the window. It was easy to spot the cranes and construction scaffolding near the walls, where all the new construction was taking place. They had finally run out of free space within the village proper itself and had started planning to build a second, smaller wall outside the first. Essentially the village would have another ring outside of the first wall. Interestingly, it had always been part of the initial planning to have multiple walls and defensive layers, but they had scrapped them in favor of one big wall. Now, however, they would be building a second wall anyway. As his eyes skimmed over the various buildings he could see from his office, he smiled as his eyes fell upon the academy. He had stopped by on a whim the other day, just to see how the school was doing. He wasn't exactly trying to hide his presence, and as a result one of the teachers with an outdoor class had spotted him and called him over to do some demonstrations. Of course he was more happy to oblige. So what if his ulterior motive was to see who was currently in school right now? The first person he thought of was Iruka, but he was either in one of the earlier years classes or wasn't even in the academy yet, since the kids where he was seemed to be 11 or 12 and just about to graduate. Only slightly depressed at this realization, he quickly discovered that the only person he could recognize in the class in front of him was a very boisterous Saratobi Asuma. He made plans in his mind to come back and explore the academy later, once he wasn't bogged down with work, just to check and see who was where, mostly out of curiosity. Even though pretty much everyone he knew that was older than him grew up fine, there were a couple special cases that he was interested in. A gentle knock on his door pulled him out of his musings. Yes? The door opened slowly, and Naruto was able to carefully mask his surprise as Uchiha Kagami entered the room. The blonde hopped up out of his chair to assist the older man, who hobbled along slightly thanks to his bad knee, but was waved off. "I'm not that old, Naruto." "Oh. Sorry? I didn't know." Kagami chuckled as he moved towards one of the other unoccupied chairs in the room. "It's fine. Just a nasty encounter with an Iwa nin during the Second War that shattered my knee. Got a pretty good replacement thanks to Tsunade-sama, but I'll never go active duty again." The retired shinobi gestured towards one of the other chairs in the room. "I'll just sit here, the walk was a little longer than I anticipated." Naruto nodded slowly as he closed the office door. "You could have sent a message, and I would have come to you, Uchi. Kagami-san." Kagami grinned at the way the blonde caught himself, but shook his head. "No, it's fine. I needed to chat with Hiruzen about a few things, but I also wanted to talk to you outside of the clan boundary. Too many years there." Naruto was immediately placed on guard, and it must have shown in his posture because Kagami idly waved his hand in the air. "Easy, Naruto. It's nothing serious, well for me, at least, but I'd rather not have people gossiping. Just the fact that I was probably seen visiting you here will set gums flapping, but there is nothing that can be done about that. All right." Naruto was somewhat reassured, but he still hated politics, and one thing he learned quickly was that Konoha was all about politics right now when they weren't at war. Some days, sadly, he might actually have preferred war, not that he'd ever tell anyone. At least objectives were fairly obvious. Beat up the bad guy and be the victor. Unfortunately, life in general was never so simple, especially when there was no visible bad guy. Kagami watched as the blonde moved back around his desk and slowly sat down. Leaning back in his chair, he scratched at his chin before looking the Uchiha patriarch in the eyes. "So, what can I do for you, Kagami-san? I'll get right to the point. It's not so much for me as it is for my daughter, Makoto." "Makoto-chan? What's wrong?" One of Kagami's eyebrows arched upward. "Makoto-chan? Can't say I saw that one coming." Naruto faltered for a moment, blushing lightly as he registered just who it was that he was speaking with. Makoto was a very good friend of his, and after a while it just became habit to show he was fond of her. He did it to nearly every female that was near his age. Most of them didn't care, and Makoto didn't seem to have anything against it either. I'm sorry, Kagami-san. I don't really mean anything by it, but I usually refer." "It's fine, Naruto." "Great, actually." Kagami held up his hand in a stopping gesture as Naruto began to ramble, effectively stopping the blonde from potentially embarrassing himself. "You see, my daughter doesn't know that I'm here right now. She's currently wandering the Uchiha district with that other man, Fugaku." Naruto nodded slowly, not sure where this was going. "Her fiancé, right?" "Yes, but not for much longer, I believe." Naruto tilted his head to the side, startled but also confused. "But from what Makoto-chan tells me, when she was younger she asked you to set up what did she call it? A contract, I think? You're against it now?" "Oh, I'm not against them. They can be useful to set boundaries or when there is definite gain in prestige or power to both sides. My daughter never really wanted a contract, but she felt she needed one because for a long time she considered herself to be untouchable. As an only child and daughter of the head of the Uchiha clan, an attractive young woman, and a wild temper when she lets it out thanks to the friends she has kept for many years. She is seen as a rather intimidating figure. Naruto felt his lips twitch upward slightly at the hint regarding his mother. Kagami must have noticed because he started smiling too. So you can see why a lot of boys her age would not be too interested in getting very close to her, both out of fear thanks to myself and Habanero-chan. So I matched her up as best I could with a slightly older man who was still close enough to her age, but yet also quite accomplished. Naruto distractedly scratched at the side of his head as he listened to Kagami and could now only come to one conclusion: she doesn't want to get married to him, then. No, she doesn't. Kagami looked inordinately pleased at this for some reason. How long ago did she decide this? I thought she said they had been engaged for a while and the wedding wasn't too far off. Kagami leaned back in his chair, stretching his leg out. I'm surprised she's told you this much. She's normally rather reserved with anyone other than myself, Minato, Taichi, and Kushina-chan. Naruto shrugged and turned his head to look out the window. Not long after the mission we went on together, she would randomly ask me to spar every now and again. It's been happening lately with increased frequency. When we take breaks and I've asked her how she's doing, she just starts talking and letting everything out. I got the impression she just needed someone to vent at, and let's just say I'm a lot better at listening than I used to be when I was younger. I understand, and I appreciate, that you listen to her. Kagami leaned back in the chair, pressing his fingertips together in front of his chest. Taichi always seems to be on assignment, Minato is always working on his new techniques, and Kushina-chan. Well. As much as I love the girl, as if she was my own daughter, she is a bit of a motormouth. I doubt Makoto could ever really get a word in. Closing his eyes and chuckling, Naruto nodded. He could definitely see that being the case. So, are you trying to tell me that you need something done with Fugaku? While he wasn't really looking forward to doing anything harmful to Sasuke's father, perhaps he could get the man to lighten up a bit. Makoto's stories about him definitely didn't paint a pretty picture. Personally, I have nothing at all against a young man, Kagami shrugged, but even I can see he isn't the right fit for my daughter. For leading a clan, he would be fine, but I don't see him being successful as a husband or even a father. He's too devoted to work and is a little too stubborn. Naruto's mind immediately snapped to Itachi and Sasuke and barely managed to squelch a derisive snort. Thinking about Itachi also made him recall the attempted coup that Fugaku would spearhead someday, and that alone left what felt like a lump of ice in his gut. But now Makoto has found someone else that has sparked her interest, and she's serious enough about it that she wants to break off her current engagement. Naruto was silent for a moment as he let Kagami's words bounce around in his head. While he was still somewhat obtuse about certain matters and probably always would be, he definitely wasn't a complete idiot anymore. A certain feeling of dread started to hang over him as all he could think was Sasuke's mom, Sasuke's mom, Sasuke's mom. The best he would likely get away with now was delaying the inevitable. Unless he was willing to potentially make an enemy of the Uchiha. That was something he was definitely hoping to avoid. Damn politics. To top it all off, he was rather wary about getting entangled in any relationships simply for practical reasons. Firstly, he would have to tell whoever he was to get involved with that he was from quite a few years in the future. Any relationship he got into would potentially stop that set of a chain of events that led to something he could know how to fix. Getting involved with someone like Makoto would change a huge series of events. The Itachi he briefly knew and the Sasuke he was a rival and teammate of would never exist. Ever. The thought process that continued from that point was staggering. No, Itachi meant that the Uchiha massacre would never happen, or it would be someone else that did it. But one of his objectives, to save the Uchiha clan, would be easily accomplished this way. Who better to confront a madman with a fully evolved Sharingan than with a clan full of the potential to do the same, even when considering the risks? It was strange that Kagami would approach him now, considering Naruto had been entertaining thoughts of trying to get to know Tsurumi a little better. She had been almost attached to his hip as he was coordinating with all the bloodline clans that had moved to Konoha from Kiri, acting as a secretary of sorts when she wasn't training. As the next potential leader of the Tsurumi clan, which was acknowledged as the most powerful among their new arrivals. She was getting good experience for dealing with administrative aspects. What Naruto found odd was that she was rather shy unless someone addressed her first. He had thought perhaps he could ask her out to get her to open up a little, but was mildly surprised to find that she already had a boyfriend. He didn't want to pry, but the kiss they shared definitely wasn't one done between family. He felt some disappointment, of course, as he got to know May a little from his future. very well in one painfully brief encounter. And had considered getting to know her now, earlier in her life. That had gotten shot down before it could really even get started. Now that he thought about it, the few times Makoto had come looking for him and Mei was still around, the Uchiha had been rougher and more aggressive than usual in their sparring sessions. It was becoming clearer and clearer. Leaning back in his chair and trying to unsuccessfully find a comfortable position, he took a deep breath and pinched the bridge of his nose. Let me guess. I'm the someone else she found? You don't sound pleased. Kagami's voice had a dangerous edge to it, but Naruto simply shook his head and sighed. It's not that. I'm flattered, honestly. She's one of the strongest kunoichi that Konoha has, is the heir to one of the strongest clans in the village, and, yes, I think she's beautiful. But it's dangerous as hell for me to get involved. Naruto opened his eyes to look at the current leader of the clan who was sitting across from him, only slightly surprised to see something that could pass as respect on the man's features. His lips were turned upward slightly in a slight grin, at least, and that made Naruto relax more than anything else. I wouldn't say it will be dangerous, exactly. It might create an uproar for a little while, but with your current standing in the village I don't think it would last. Naruto blinked. Wait. You're supporting this? Of course. It's what my daughter wants, and like I said, I was never a huge fan of Fugaku to begin with. There simply were no better options at the time. Kagami idly played with the hem on one of his sleeves as he spoke. Naruto's brain, meanwhile, was going a mile a minute. Things were already messed up because of the clans from Kiri here, but if he went through with helping to void Makoto's engagement to Fugaku, thoughts of how much would change once again passed through his mind. The part of him that was male would never reject the idea completely. From what he knew of Makoto, she was definitely very close to his ideal of feminine perfection. Fugaku was an idiot to not treat her better. Thinking back, he couldn't help but wonder what she was like when he was growing up. He didn't really have any memories of her that came to his mind other than occasional visits to get Sasuke at the academy and one brief glimpse at the military police headquarters. But he couldn't remember anything more than that, and Sasuke never told him more than her name. He always had a rather glorified view of what parents were because he never had any of his own, but if this was what it was really like before Sasuke and Itachi were born. Naruto? The blonde immediately sat up straight, quickly apologizing, sorry. I just let my mind wander. About Makoto? There might have been a teasing tone to Kagami's voice, but Naruto didn't know the man well enough to be sure. Sort of. Just thinking about what I knew of her from our spars and occasional chats. It's not much, I'm afraid. Well, you've only been public knowledge for about 2 months, so I wouldn't expect you to know her life story. But you'll have some time to get to know her soon. I've managed to convince Hiruzen to dispatch you on a mission with my daughter to get you out of the village for a few days. Naruto was shocked. How did you manage to pull that off? I didn't think the old man would want to let me out of his sight for the near future. Kagami barked out a laugh, the old man? Hiruzen? I know he's getting up there, but damn. Does he let you get away with that? Sometimes. Naruto blushed and looked away. I've known him for so long. He's like the closest thing I have to a dad, so I just call him the old man. It wasn't a complete truth, but it was close enough. As the Uchiha's chuckles settled down, he reached into his robes and pulled out a sealed scroll, then tossed it to Naruto, who caught it in one hand. It should be simple for one person, and a walk in the park for 2 of you. It's A rank, but we probably could have given it to a veteran Chunin squad. A group of militia from Valley Country deserted their posts, and our hunter squads have picked up rumors of them hiding out along our southern border with River. Scour the area, and if you find them, wipe them out. They don't know anything of importance, but they need to be made an example of to discourage further desertions. This was likely a fluke, but they don't want to risk it. Naruto nodded as he opened the scroll and read the details. It was minimum pay for an A rank, but he wasn't exactly hurting for money, so he didn't care too much. The mission itself likely would be as easy as Kagami claimed, he could probably have finished it himself within 2 or 3 days, the 6-day window they allowed seemed a little much. But then they probably were expecting a veteran Chunin squad and not a capable Jonin and. Well. Him. Rolling the scroll back up, he placed it on his desk and hummed for a moment. Just out of curiosity, why can't you just break the engagement off? Mainly because it's too late to do it that way. Kagami shrugged as he moved on his chair, likely trying to find another comfortable position. Had it been only a couple of months after the original engagement, Fugaku likely would have been fine with it. But now that they have been seeing each other for such a long time, He sees it as an insult. Believe me, I already tried it through the proper channels and even went to appeal to him directly with Makoto at my side. With only a month until the wedding though, he's within his rights to refuse. Why do both have to agree? Aren't there ways to break contracts, even if there are penalties? Kagami nodded, yes, but in this case all contract breakers were meant to be agreements. There is no way a contract break will be acknowledged by any Uchiha if only one side wants to break it. Fugaku is both stubborn and ambitious, there is no reason for him to break it on what he sees as a whim of Makoto, and most others would back his choice. Of course, like any contract, there are emergency clauses that can go into effect when certain criterion are met, such as death, sickness. He waved his hand in the air in a rotating motion, as if to signify that the list of bad things went on, but stopped and focused his eyes on Naruto for his last word. Infidelity. Naruto's jaw went slack for a moment before his head promptly fell forward and his forehead hit his desktop with a resounding thump. Now, it's likely not the way you're thinking, and I'm using a very loose interpretation of the word. A simple kiss will break it off. Huh? How is that possible? The blonde's head lifted as he asked his question, staring at Kagami as if he was a madman. It's part of the way the contract seal works. As long as both of their chakra states are unchanged from the moment the contract is sealed, it will remain in effect. So Makoto and Fugaku have both gone nearly a year without doing anything with a member of the opposite sex. As far as I know, Makoto has never done anything, ever. However, I haven't asked her either. It isn't my business. Her mother would have killed me. Naruto chuckled nervously as he started a grinning Kagami, thinking about the man's words. He would have to check out what kind of seal was on that contract. Was it self-updating? How was that possible? I still don't see how it's possible to have a seal update itself based on external stimulus, unless. One of Kagami's eyebrows twitched upwards, so you know some things about sealing? Well, Makoto and Fugaku have to go to the clan chambers to place their chakra in the seal once a week or after returning from a mission. The seal can detect residual chakra from another within a week time period, so neither of them have had a mission that has lasted more than a few days over the last year. Naruto knew about residual chakra. It often happened when you got into taijutsu fights with an opponent that laced their attacks with their chakra. The Hyuga specialized in that. When they would close off Tenketsu with their Gyuuken strikes, their chakra would leave its own residue in your chakra system that would last for up to a week, depending on the severity of the strikes. It wasn't harmful, it was just the way chakra worked. It was how medics were able to find out how shinobi died, and sometimes even who did it. Everyone's chakra had their own unique signature. Seems like it's rather complicated for something so simple. True, but it's been used by the Uchiha since before Konoha existed, so who am I to argue about it now? I'll admit that it is unusual to use a contract like this, but since both of them were already of age, there was no choice. It was also Makoto who asked for the 1-year grace period. Fugaku didn't seem too eager to wait that long, but he eventually agreed. Naruto simply sighed and shook his head. He never understood some clan laws. He had sworn to change the Hyuga's practice of the caged bird seal when he became Hokage, but that never really panned out for obvious reasons. But with the Uchiha. Wait. Whoa. Wait. Makoto is the heir, right? If she gets with me, what does that mean? Kagami smirked. Technically, since the Uchiha are a patriarchal clan, you'll be the leader. Of course there will be elder advisors and. But I wasn't born an Uchiha. I don't have the Sharingan. I'm an Uzumaki and as distant relatives of the Senju. I don't think that will go over very well. Naruto was standing up now, looking panicked, while Kagami was still sitting in his chair, calmly staring. The two continued staring at each other in some strange sort of silence until Naruto eventually sat back down. Kagami nodded his head at the blonde and continued speaking. As I was going to say, there are elder advisors in the clan who may not like you at first, but even they will come to understand the sway you have in Konoha, and by extension, Konoha's Hokage. You have Hiruzen's ear as much as I do, and at the rate he's completing difficult assignments and leading teams I'd bet on Minato being the next Hokage. So you'll have an advantage with him too. I've always thought the Uchiha needed to be more involved with the village, not removed from it like so many of us seem content being. But if you really want to shake things up, placing my daughter as the matriarch and letting her take charge. Well. Kagami's voice trailed off as he shrugged and looked out one of the two windows in Naruto's little office. Meanwhile, the blonde realized for the first time that he never knew what happened to Uchiha Kagami when he was growing up. He had never been one to read up on clan history, especially not once the Fourth War hit, but he didn't ever remember hearing the man's name come out of anyone's mouth. Was he forcefully retired? All of these thoughts happened in a brief moment. It didn't take long for him to pick back up on what Kagami was now saying. The fact that Kagami was also talking about the two of them in such a way that it made it sound like their getting together would be a certainty. He wasn't terribly keen on that, but so far the positives far outweighed the negatives. He'd feel like an ass for a while for pulling one over on Fugaku, but considering how Mikoto had been sharing with him how disillusioned she was with the man during their last few spars, he wouldn't feel that bad. Still, it would take some getting used to if they did in fact work out. We'll be there to help you as well, and Mikoto will have an obligation to as your wife should you follow through with actually wanting to lead. Regardless, as I've already explained by now, I see only good things from having you in the clan. Well. Naruto's mouth opened and closed a few times as he contemplated on what to say before finally sighing and nodding, almost as if resigning himself to a new fate. Thank you. Kagami nodded. That grunt must be a genetic trait. Thankfully, the rest of that day had passed uneventfully, other than a brief visit from Minato. He wanted help from Naruto in putting the finishing touches on his new Hiraishin and needed a guinea pig. Of course, Naruto was happy to oblige, as he had used it briefly in the future, but it was always a dream of his to see his father using it. Or at least it became one once he found out who his father was, anyway. He actually didn't even see Mikoto until the night before they were to leave on their mission, and even then neither of them really said much. Mikoto was blushing slightly and couldn't look him in the eye. It was likely that Kagami told her what she had to do if she really wanted to break things off with Fugaku. While Naruto wasn't sure exactly how the situation had explained things to her, he knew that he wouldn't have a problem giving Mikoto a kiss. She was a beautiful young woman, of that there was no doubt. His only awkwardness came from the fact that he didn't know if Kagami told her about him knowing what was necessary, other than the fact that she needed to have his residual chakra on her in some manner. Mikoto barely managed to make plans to meet up the next morning at the gate before she fled almost as quickly as she had arrived. Chuckling to himself, Naruto had left a message with Hiruzen that he would be heading out the next morning, then went home and crashed for the night. That morning had passed uneventfully, and they had traveled to the southern border in complete silence. In fact, they had both been completely silent for the entire trip, plus their arrival. Mikoto had gone in to get reservations at the inn of a small border town before him, asking for a single room with one bed. She had refused to say anything more to him about it, and Naruto figured it would be best to bite his tongue until they actually needed to use the room. He had no problem sleeping on the floor if it came to that. Their first day of searching had turned up nothing useful other than a few disjointed sightings from various people living in the area, though none of them could really point the duo in a specific direction. Naruto planned to make use of Sage Mode to track them down once they at least had a lead on the Nukanin's general location, but figured he'd leave that for use after a couple days. If Mikoto actually wanted to go through with, well, being with him, then he'd have to tell her his secrets anyway. Using it would likely be a last resort because he had permission from the Hokage and Danzo to kill her if he thought she couldn't be trusted to not talk about the things he would eventually have to tell her. He really didn't want to do that. It wasn't until Mikoto asked about giving up for the day and returning to their room that they actually started talking. Their first real talk of the day didn't even start until a flicker of surprise crossed his face when he saw Mikoto with her Sharingan active as they were heading back. She had likely been scanning the area for traces of residual active chakra, like genjutsu traps and active seal tags that Nukanin were often fond of using. What? Mikoto was looking at him curiously as her Sharingan faded back into the dark brown, almost black color that her eyes typically were. Normally he probably wouldn't have flinched at all, he'd gotten so used to seeing the Sharingan, but the sun was setting below the horizon at just a perfect point behind her to where it silhouetted her frame perfectly, and the red eyes with pale skin and black hair made her look incredibly vibrant for a fleeting moment. Instead of telling her this, however, Naruto simply offered a faint smile and shook his head. I'm not used to seeing your Sharingan active. You've never used it in one of our spars. That's all. Do you have a problem? With the Sharingan, I mean? Naruto had to bite his tongue to keep from saying what his initial responses would have been. Instead, he settled with, I don't have a problem with the Sharingan at all. Only with some people that have used it the way they shouldn't have. Oh. I see. Naruto could tell by the questioning lilt to her voice and the puzzled expression on her face that she really didn't. It was going to be really hard to tell her some of the things he knew. If she decided to go that far with him, anyway. The rest of their trip back to the inn was silent, not that Naruto was expecting intense conversation. In fact, once again they didn't speak a single word until it was time for him to go take his shower. She went into their single restroom first and came out wearing just her normal uniform minus any footwear, gear, and vest. He assumed she had cleaned them because they looked fresh, though he didn't do a close inspection. They were all taught techniques that could clean clothes somewhat while out in the wild while they were in the academy. It would remove sweat, but not blood. After his shower, he had exited the restroom in much the same manner, only in his uniform top and bottom, with the mesh underneath. Their next spoken words weren't until he was about to get comfortable on the floor. She was on one side of the bed, but he wasn't about to presume. Naruto? Do you not like me that much? Wah. Of course not. Where did that come from? Makoto shifted on the bed and lifted herself up so that she was propped up on one of her elbows as she stared at him. He hadn't laid down completely yet, so he was stuck in some sort of halfway position between laying down and getting up. My father hinted that the two of you had talked briefly about me, but he would not tell me how much you talked about. I'm beginning to wonder if you are trying to avoid me. Naruto tried to keep his expression neutral and slowly rose to his feet once again. I'm not avoiding you at all. I'm just trying to remain professional and not overstep any boundaries. At least until you want to change them. Makoto looked surprised for a moment before dropping back down onto the bed and burying her face in her pillow. Naruto simply stood there for a moment and watched to see if she would move again or if she would say anything further. She didn't, however, and after about a minute of standing there he decided to move forward and climb onto the side of the bed. The bed itself was actually full size, so it could fit two people comfortably without much extra room. Makoto could easily feel his weight shift the bed, though, since she turned her head enough to be able to watch him as he settled on the side. It was strange, in a way, for him to not feel any nervousness at all. Just 2 or 3 years ago he would have been sweating bullets, but now he felt calm, and if he really had to describe it, he would say he was amused. That was mostly because of how Makoto was acting, though if she had no legitimate experience with men, he could understand completely. He sighed in his mind. Even though Makoto was the one who wanted out, he might have to be the one to take initiative at first. Thinking of that, he tossed her a casual smile. Is this better? He saw her head nod against a pillow and the edge of her lip that he could see curved upward slightly, but that was about all he got. This meant that he would be the one who had to take the initial plunge to get her to open up. Getting comfortable, he rolled on the bed until he was looking up at the ceiling and placed his hands behind his head. So, you really don't want to get married? We've talked about this a little before, but you never really sounded against it. Naruto could hear her breathing hitch for a second before she shifted. He turned his head slightly to see that she was moving back into her previous position on her side, facing him. I do want to get married. Just not to the person I have a contact with. Fugaku. A moment of silence, followed by, yes. Fugaku. Naruto closed his eyes, having a hard time reconciling this fact. He had no idea that Sasuke's parents had gotten together because of circumstance rather than any mutual attraction. Now something? Or rather someone has come along that you think is a better choice. So far, anyway. There was another moment of silence, longer than the first, followed by an even quieter, yes. Opening his eyes, he rolled onto his side so that he could look at the woman laying next to him. She didn't flinch or look away this time, instead staring straight into his eyes. He couldn't tell if she was blushing or not, the room was too dark. There's a lot about me you don't know. More than meets the eye. For all you know, I only existed starting 3 months ago. Makoto didn't say anything at first, instead just nodding her head while never breaking eye contact. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it and her eyes before inhaling deeply and attempting to speak in halting sentences. I found that I started admiring you after only knowing who you were for a couple weeks. Maybe part of that was because of Kushina. She couldn't stop talking about you, and I found myself getting curious. So I invited you to sparring practice. I figured you had to be good if you could go toe-to-toe with Minato. Then I heard what you said to Jiraiya-sensei. Naruto blinked and knew he was blushing as soon as he remembered exactly what it was that he had said at that moment. He moved his hand, that was resting against his side, to lightly smack against his forehead in an exasperated gesture, only for Makoto to grab said hand before he could leave it there. He watched, curious, as she held his hand between them and entwined her fingers in his. "Do you remember what you said to him? That he was a pervert and shouldn't be doing that." Makoto laughed lightly across from him, a small smile on her features as she shook her head. "He was the sensei for my genin team. We were never able to break him of the habit, so I doubt anyone else can." "No, you said something else to him." Naruto knew immediately what she was fishing for. "I said you were beautiful." She stared at him for a moment again before a smile larger than he had ever seen before appeared on her face. "Yes. No one other than my father has ever said that to me before." Naruto couldn't help but be stunned when he heard that. Was everyone here completely blind? He had never really stared at her on purpose because of her looks, but other than his future mother Kushina. He was biased in that regard, and perhaps Makoto was definitely one of the most beautiful women around. Men are idiots. Makoto laughed before bringing his hand towards her mouth and briefly kissing the back of it. He was surprised at the gesture, but for the first time he could remember, she seemed genuinely happy, so he decided not to comment. It wasn't until she used both of her hands to pull his hand and cuddle it just under her chin that he spoke again. "Makoto-chan?" Naruto had to admit that she looked adorable right now. She seemed to be positively glowing with happiness. If nothing else, that pretty much sealed the deal in his mind. "Over the next few days, while we're doing this mission, we'll get to know each other better. Likes, dislikes, hobbies, dreams for the future. That sort of thing." Who knew Kakashi's little introductory questions would come in handy? "If you decide you still want to go through with this when we're done, I'll help you break your contract." Makoto's eyes went white as she clutched his hand more firmly in hers. "Promise?" she whispered. "I promise." End of chapter 10. Chapter 11. Memories. "Naruto, Kakashi. Come here, I think this is it." Both shinobi quickly moved over towards where Darui was standing, brushing his hand across a wall. "What is it?" Naruto was waving his hand in front of his face in an effort to keep from breathing in so much dust. They were in one of the ruined buildings of Uzashigakure, looking for something. They weren't sure what, but the Tsuchikage had mentioned they pillaged an incomplete scroll that looked like a very powerful teleportation or transmission jutsu of some sort back during the Second War. The three of them had come to what was left of the old village in hopes of finding some clues. "Yeah, look." Kakashi opened the scroll. "I think the script on it matches the same script on the wall." Kakashi pulled the scroll out of the holder on his back and opened it up. Moving it up against the wall, the trio compared the script, looking at both of them to see if it was a match. The scroll itself told them that the technique was in fact a method of transportation and that it required a lot of power. But exactly what it did was what they were trying to find out. Naruto started to move down to examine the rest of the wall. The pictures on the wall were drawn in a series, and in each series there was one person standing in the middle. He wasn't completely sure, but it looked like they drew that person at different ages because as the pictures continued the person in the middle would get taller and then eventually started using what he guessed was a cane. It was the first three and last three pictures that made him curious because they were exactly the same. Well, there was one single difference. The person in the middle of the first three was no longer in the middle of the last three, he was off to the side. But the person in the middle of the first three was the same as the person in the last three. There was something else that was nagging at him though. "Hey Kakashi." Naruto shouted in the direction where Kakashi was. It seemed he and Darui had moved off to examine something else down the long hallway. "Yeah? What kind of technique did you think this was?" "A space and time one, from a couple of the script runes I saw. Including the ones you recognized. That style is normally how you transport things anyway." "Why?" "Because I see part of the Horatian seal on the wall here." It only took a moment for Kakashi and Darui to arrive next to him, and he pointed out where the seal was on the painting. It was right under where the person in the middle was standing the whole time. He was too busy paying attention to the person and not the script under him. "Something I don't understand," Naruto began to comment, "is that I only recognize the movement part of the seal because all Horatian does is move me forward in time to my destination and then barely a second back in time, so it seems like I'm moving instantly. But there is a lot more to this one." He further explained what he had noticed about the images, especially regarding the person in the middle, and how that changes in the last 3 pictures. Based on his explanation, it only took Darui another moment to piece it all together. It's time travel. But it looks like the purpose is to take a large leap back in time. The person in the middle stays the same the whole time. It's just that the first person in the middle moves off to the side as he observes a younger self in the past. Darui's hand traced the lines of the seal under the person in the middle before he stepped backwards, observing the whole thing again. Kakashi, look. Didn't we see a pattern like this in the other room back there? Yes. The silver-haired man nodded as he examined the images with his original uncovered eye. Each of the people is standing in one of those circles we saw on the floor in the other room. Why do they have to stand there? Naruto inquired. I'm not certain, but the only thing I can suggest is that they are powering the seal in the middle. I don't know if you feel the pull, Naruto, but Minato-sensei always said that the larger the distance he had to travel, the bigger the drain he felt on his chakra. Kakashi reached out and brushed some dust away from the painting. It seems to me that the further back you want to travel, the more power it would take. Naruto idly scratched at his stomach as he continued looking at the figure standing in the middle and the seal under it. He stood completely still for a second as his eyes appeared to glaze over before turning his head to look at the other two. Hey, Kurama wants to know how far back you think we can go if we were to use the chakra of a Biju? Kakashi and Darui looked at each other in shock before looking back at Naruto. It was Kakashi who answered, though. Probably quite a few years. Meanwhile in the past. The remaining 3 days of their assignment were uneventful, at least if the moment they found the group of Nukenin wasn't counted. The only real excitement that happened was when 2 of Naruto's clones began to do a collaboration technique of wind and water in order to quickly eliminate a bandit camp they happened to pass. It gathered Makoto's interest, making her request to do an experiment with her affinity. Fire. The 2 of them quickly learned that the great breakthrough and phoenix flower techniques, when mixed, make for quite the impressive display. Most of the remainder of their other days were spent doing the actual searching for their objective, though each consecutive day Makoto asked that they return to the inn earlier and earlier. He wasn't complaining about it one bit either. Makoto was a very interesting woman and had plenty of stories to share that revolved around her and Kushina, her genin team, and the things they did to get Jiraiya to stop being a pervert. Naruto desperately wanted to share some of his stories with her, but pretty much everything he wanted to tell her was considered classified at the moment. As it was, he was conflicted about telling her certain things about himself. Not because they may sound absurd. Even if they would. But more or less because he didn't want Makoto to like or dislike him for the wrong reasons at this point in their friendship. At one point he finally used Sage Mode to pinpoint the location of the Nukenin, and explaining that was a stretch without giving too much away. He had to chalk it up to simply being a special sensory technique, though Makoto didn't look terribly convinced. He managed to escape too many more questions by promising to explain it in a little more detail once they were no longer on a mission. With everything that was likely to happen upon their return to Konoha, he was counting on her forgetting about it until he was legitimately able to tell her everything. He considered himself lucky that she didn't have her Sharingan active when he was using it, or she would have noticed something different about his chakra. He'd heard plenty of stories about how the Uchiha used to be and was relieved that his beliefs about Makoto were true. She was one of the more polite ones that didn't activate her Sharingan on allies. Their second night in the same room was nearly a repeat of the first, though Makoto simply stared at him until he climbed onto the bed. She had started up the conversation this time, asking how he felt about clan life. Being honest, he had no real opinion because when he was made aware of what clan actually meant, the Uzumaki clan was already gone. She pretty much informed him that she'd teach him everything he needed to know if he was willing to learn. He somewhat jokingly asked if that was a sort of proposal, to which she didn't say or respond to anything else that night, but simply held tightly onto his hand until she fell asleep. The third night was her asking him about some of the missions he had when he was working for the Hokage. He stressed that there wasn't much he could talk about, but ventured back to some missions that he hoped she wouldn't know didn't happen. Well, they did for him in the future, but not in her past. Once again he had to skirt the full truth until he was free to tell her everything. Assuming they got to that point. But for now she seemed to accept what she heard, even with the oohs and ahs in all the appropriate places. Naruto stopped musing about the past couple of days as he finished with his shower, thinking that they had gotten closer, but not that much closer. Relationships don't form out of a vacuum, though they had both definitely made large strides in getting to know each other. He chuckled to himself as he shut off the water. It was still hard to not think of the woman in the other room as Sasuke's and Itachi's mother. At least as the days had been passing, that thought popped into his head less and less. After getting dried off and dressed, he pondered what they would discuss during their last night here, alone. They had found their targets yesterday, and Naruto had several clones keeping watch just in case they moved. Their plan was to take them out on the way back home tomorrow. Thinking of home, the blonde had no idea what kind of work was waiting for him back in Konoha, not to mention thoughts of how people would react once word of Makoto's broken engagement spread through the hidden village. Hopefully it wouldn't get blown all out of proportion, but knowing what he knew of the village from his time, it was highly unlikely. There were too many gossip mongers. His thoughts ceased abruptly upon his exit of the restroom, however, when he noticed that Makoto was standing right outside the door, obviously waiting for him. Not only that, but she had changed out of the shinobi clothes she had worn for the past nights and had actually changed into something resembling sleepwear. It was very reserved sleepwear, granted, with dark cloth long pants and a button-down shirt, but it wasn't nearly as loosely worn as her shinobi gear. The thought female was very firmly etched into his mind as he stared at her. All in all, it painted a very pretty picture. The fact that she was standing there, looking very demure, wasn't helping Naruto's brain to restart any faster either. Sasuke who? How does it look? The blonde's mouth opened and closed a few times before he shook his head and grinned. Reboot successful. Very nice. I'm flattered that you'll let me see you wearing that. Makoto blushed, looking away and fidgeting ever so slightly, but didn't say anything further. Naruto watched as she grabbed at the lower hem of the shirt and twisted it about. Any potential thoughts of arousal from seeing her before were completely banished from his mind as he suddenly realized that she had probably no idea what to expect, obviously having never been in a relationship. In a short, painful twinge, he was also reminded of Hinata, who he found out had liked him for a very long time but had no sympathetic figure to tell her what to do about it. Then she almost had to get herself killed in order to work up the nerve to tell him. Definitely not one of his better memories about the girl. In a strange twist, a part of him wanted to blame his mother for having found his father so early and being too happy with her own life to pay attention to her friend, but that would be very unfair. By the time she was likely old enough to understand that Makoto wasn't happy, it would have been too late. Besides that, she had already been dealt a huge blow by the loss of Uzumaki, a rough childhood, and an attempted kidnapping. Add being a Jinchuriki on top of that, and it was highly likely that she was trying to only focus on the good things in life right now. Sighing, Naruto stepped forward, apparently startling Makoto as she went rigid and looked up at him sharply. He tried to keep his expression sympathetic and passive as he offered his hand to her. Makoto-chan. Huh? She looked in confusion between his face and the hand that he was offering. One of her hands had already lifted a bit, as if to take his, but had stopped halfway. Take my hand. Come sit with me. Let's talk for a bit. He tried to sound confident, and in his opinion he managed to pull it off. Never mind the fact that his heartbeat was rapidly starting to increase when he thought about how much the future may potentially change in these next few minutes. Looking down and nodding once, Makoto had immediately latched onto his offered hand, which he quickly noted felt a little cold and clammy. She probably thought he was going to pull her over to the bed, but once they walked past it and headed for the only chair in the room, he almost felt like he was pulling her along instead of her following willingly. Trying to ignore it, he sat down in the only chair in the room. Luckily it was a larger one and was plenty comfortable, if a bit low to the ground. He carefully pulled Makoto down onto his lap to sit sideways, only for her to let out a brief startled yelp and become stiff as a board, looking anywhere and everywhere but at him. She had released his hand, but Naruto responded by wrapping his arms around her waist as she tried to literally scramble away. Makoto-chan. Makoto-chan, calm down please. His protests didn't do much at first, though when she probably realized he wasn't just going to let go, but at least not do anything further with her, she finally began to settle down. She didn't relax, though, and he could feel her trembling slightly under his hold. Guilt was starting to creep into his mind. He was sincerely hoping that she was a little more comfortable with him by this point. Even if they had only gotten to know each other much more closely over these past few days, they had known each other and been at least acquaintances. If not distant friends and sparring partners. For a few months. Even when he tried to look at her, she made sure she was looking away. Biting back a sigh, he settled for looking at the back of her head with a frown on his face. "What's wrong? You're acting nothing like the woman I remember, the one I went hunting for Nukanen with, or the one I spar with. I didn't want to startle you, but I wanted our talk to have some meaning. I'm sorry if I scared you." Naruto resisted the urge to release her so that he could run one of his hands back through his hair. "If you want to get up, we can go talk some other time." She stopped moving and didn't seem to be as stiff, but was still trembling. "I'm just not used to this." Her voice came out so soft, he barely heard it. But it was there, and that was all he needed. Being this close to a man? She shook her head, slowly. Being this close to anyone? Another shake, faster this time. Intimacy? Makoto stilled again and didn't breathe either, as if she was seriously contemplating the word. Slowly she inhaled again, relaxed a bit more. "Yes, intimacy. I've never been intimate with anyone. Like this. She gestured at the air with her hand for a second, searching for the right word. "I don't think scared is the right word. I'm not scared of being close to you. Nervous, maybe? Other than my parents and Kushina, I never really get close to anyone." Naruto was still frowning. Just what kind of environment was it like growing up with the Uchiha? To be scared to get close to anyone, physically and emotionally? That must suck. She always spoke like she was close to her father, though perhaps it was more respect than genuine affection. Maybe he was a comfortable closeness, whereas he was someone she was interested in, and she didn't know how to express that. As for Kushina, it was likely something that Makoto had simply adjusted to, because he could tell early on that his future mother was one of those touchy-feely types. The fact that Kushina was female probably kept Makoto from having issues as well. The blonde relaxed his grip on his partner, silently hoping that she wouldn't bolt from his lap. He nearly sighed in relief when she didn't, so he let one arm go slack while his other moved up to slowly rub her arm. "We can just stay like this until you're comfortable then?" Makoto nodded slowly, and they sat there in silence with him slowly rubbing her arm for a few minutes. Gradually her trembling stopped, and she was no longer completely stiff either. Eventually she even leaned her shoulder against his chest, slightly. Naruto was a little surprised, but chose not to comment as he didn't want to completely ruin her comfort level with any jokes. It wasn't until he felt that she was completely calm that he decided to ask how she was doing. "What I had planned to talk about might be difficult for you to talk about if you're uncomfortable. Did you just want to call it a night? We can try to wake up early tomorrow, unless you want to call off the whole thing we had planned on." Makoto stiffened for barely a moment before faintly shaking her head. "No, I want to talk to you about anything. Everything. Okay. I guess I'll start then. Does Fugaku treat you well?" He knew it was a bit of a bomb to drop, but it was better to start off big than worry about the small things in discussions like this. It let him know where the conversational boundaries would lie. Doing that often came in handy dealing with shinobi from other nations who didn't enjoy taking orders from him. He would always be thankful for Shikaku teaching him the things he did. Makoto had stilled for several seconds before turning to look at him, though she looked more confused more than anything else. "I don't understand what you mean. He treats me as one should treat the heir to the clan." Naruto shook his head, frowning. "Do you want to be treated like the heir, or do you want to be treated like a woman, as Uchiha Makoto? Not as an object or title, but an actual human being with her own wants and desires?" When Makoto looked away but didn't reply, Naruto decided to continue. "The first time I saw you with him, it was right before I called you to go with us for the Kiri mission. He looked bored, and you looked sad. I was about to ask you to go do something right then, after I gave you the mission, but I knew it wouldn't be proper. It wasn't my place. Though I guess, if I knew then what I know now, perhaps I should have taken that chance, huh?" Naruto only meant it as a half-hearted joke, but the small smile he got to see on her face was definitely worth it. "I don't think it would have changed anything, honestly. At least, not then." Makoto pursed her lips, thinking carefully. "But I would have appreciated the offer, I'm sure." Naruto couldn't help but smile at that and finally decided it was time for him to release his hold around her waist with his other arm and lean back. Makoto was briefly startled by this adjustment, but then seemed to muster her courage or whatever it was she needed and leaned to her side, against his chest again. Then, surprising him, she leaned her head forward so that her forehead rested very lightly against his jaw. He grabbed one of her hands with his and wrapped his other arm around the back of her waist. She didn't stiffen, this time, and even returned the grip his hand had on hers. "So, Makoto-chan. What is it you are looking for? Naruto listened as she inhaled deeply, then exhaled. What do you mean? What are you looking for in the person who you want to marry? She was quiet for a moment, then slowly asked, does that really matter? Of course it matters. How else do you expect to be happy? There was another quiet pause, where he could only hear the sound of her breathing. I've never really thought about it before. I always grew up knowing what I might have to expect. Had my mother lived longer, I might have had a sibling who could take up the leadership position of the clan. But since she didn't, the responsibility fell to me to find someone worthwhile to wed. I can say now that it wasn't exactly what I wanted, but in a clan like the Uchiha, certain responsibilities must be upheld. Naruto felt horrible listening to that. Not only because of what she said, but because that was the most he'd gotten her to say at one time since they left on this mission. Okay, well. Just forget about all that. I'm sure when you were a young girl, you had dreams, right? Mikoto sighed. I hardly think those matter now. I think they are important. Right now, that should matter to you. Tell me. Did you ever have those dreams about a prince coming to rescue you? Naruto's tone had a teasing lilt, which Mikoto immediately picked up on. He heard her chuckle, and a moment later her free hand whacked lightly against the center of his chest. No, there was never a prince. Or anyone really. I didn't need rescuing. I would be happy with someone who didn't treat me like a trophy and who wanted children. I didn't know what having children meant at first, but even after I learned I realized I wanted my own. Well, at least there was something Fugaku did right in his time. How many? He felt Mikoto shift against him before she answered, as if she was trying to get more comfortable. 3. 2 boys and a girl. Any particular order? He felt her head shift slightly against his in a small nod. The boys first. They could lead the clan together. She hummed for a moment. Then the girl. So I could dote on her and she wouldn't have to grow up like I did. It sounded close to what really happened from his time, and Naruto wondered for a second why there was no third child in his time. Maybe Kurama's appearance and the blame placed on the Uchiha clan tempered that desire? Nodding his head slightly, Naruto murmured, that's a nice dream. I was an orphan, so I always wanted a big family. Oh? She sounded intrigued and surprised, and though he couldn't see her face at the moment, Naruto wanted to imagine that she was at least grinning. How many for you? At first, I always thought 2 was a good number. A boy that I could teach all my killer techniques to, and a girl so that I could threaten boyfriends. Mikoto burst out into giggles at that, and Naruto found himself loving the sound. Only 2? That's not very big, even though you said that was what you wanted at first. She pulled her head back, probably so she could look at his face. He turned his own head slightly to look at her as she continued, what about now? Now? Naruto broke out into a big grin. Definitely 9. 9. Mikoto was obviously startled for a brief moment before she burst into laughter at this one. What could possibly make you want 9? She asked in between chuckles. Here's to you, Kurama. Oh, I don't know. I always thought it was a nice number. 8 just seemed like a strange place to stop, and 10 seemed like a little too much to handle, but 9 seemed just right. Mikoto continued laughing, and Naruto found himself chuckling along with her. In a surprising move, he felt one of her arms snake over his shoulders, behind his neck. He turned his head to look at her, obviously surprised at this action, only to see her head resting against his shoulder as she looked. Content. I'm surprised. He gestured at her arm. You seemed like a nervous wreck barely a few minutes ago. She shrugged her shoulder that wasn't resting against him. I'm comfortable. I've never done this myself, but I've seen other people do things similar. It wasn't too hard to copy. He grinned. Didn't need to use the Sharingan for it? No Sharingan needed, she said between more laughs. Thinking of her laugh, he realized it was showing up more and more, and he was grateful for it. She had laughed more today than he had ever heard her laugh in the months he had known her. That was a scary thought, because he thought Kushina and Taichi were both pretty funny. Minato wasn't a slouch either, but he didn't try to make people laugh like the other 2 did. They were quiet for several moments as what they were talking about settled in their minds. Or at least, that was the case for Naruto. He had barely faced forward again when Mikoto spoke quietly in his ear. I'll give you 5. His head snapped back around, giving her a surprised look. 5? You mean 5? When he didn't continue and his expression seemed to glaze over, she chuckled and grinned, apparently pleased with his reaction. Yes. I've been in pain before, but I've heard childbirth is on an entirely different level. Assuming my health holds up, I'll promise you 5. If I can handle it, then perhaps. Her voice trailed off, and for a moment she offered him a teasing smile which he would literally kill to see again. Perhaps I can manage 9. Naruto was flabbergasted for barely a second before giving her a shallow smile and shaking his head. I just like the number 9. That seems like too much to put you through, and I wouldn't expect you to go through with that. Nor even 5, really. Mikoto released a hold she had on his other hand and brought her other hand up, now clasping them both behind his neck. Naruto, how many do you really want? Be serious, please. While part of him felt that a talk like this was all a bit premature. They were talking about children, but hadn't even kissed yet. Somewhere along the line they got the order in which things were supposed to be done all wrong. He knew he was often considered unpredictable, but this was just getting ridiculous. Grumbling to himself in his mind, he remembered that she was still waiting for an answer. It was the same answer he was prepared to tell Sakura once upon a time when he was still an optimist about the war, and perhaps even tease Kuretsuchi with one day, if that had ever gotten anywhere beyond looking at each other with smoldering eyes. Pushing the past out of his mind, he stared at Mikoto and clearly said, as many as you'd be willing to give me. The moment he said that, he couldn't tell for sure, but something just seemed to click in Mikoto's eyes, and her entire demeanor changed. He felt her hands move from holding each other to literally grabbing the hair on the back of his head. Her entire body pressed firmly into his, and her hands held his head steady so that she could look directly into his eyes. Naruto. Help me break the contract. The blonde was quiet for a moment, staring into Mikoto's dark eyes. Moving his hand up, he rested it against her cheek and wasn't surprised at all when her head tilted against it ever so slightly. But still she kept her eyes locked on his. Are you completely sure about this? I'm going to warn you again. I have a lot of secrets. Her responding question was immediate. Will any of them harm Konoha or the Uchiha clan? Naruto's reply was almost as fast, not in the slightest. But other than that, I also can't promise I'd be the best father material. I mean, I didn't exactly have any parents to raise me. Having Kushina as a little sister hasn't been easy these past couple months either. I mean, can you imagine her as an aunt? I can barely handle her now. Oh, and on top of that, there is always Naruto. He blinked for a moment after being suddenly cut off, looking like a Nara deer that was just caught in a flashy jutsu. Yes, Mikoto-chan? Shut up and kiss me. The rest of that night had ended pleasantly enough, and the pleasantness had continued into the morning and a large portion of their journey back to Konoha. While she was obviously not experienced in any way at all when it came to doing anything of a romantic or sexual nature with the opposite gender, he was greatly enjoying her expressions and attitude as it changed into what many would consider a giggling schoolgirl. She was full of laughs and smiles the entire journey back, only putting on the business face once they got closer to the gate. The hardest thing for her to handle upon their arrival was finding out that he was summoned immediately to go talk to the Hokage, but a quick hug and a few whispered words of encouragement must have helped because she couldn't hide the small smile on her face as he disappeared. The visit to the Hokage's office was a quick one. He simply reported that he had returned and that apparently both of his missions were successful. There was a nod, followed by a comment that the skirmishes were picking up in intensity and he should make sure he was in peak condition. That done, he quickly ventured to his office to find that there wasn't nearly as much paperwork to take care of as he had been thinking there would be. Either someone helped him out a bit or there really wasn't a lot that happened while he was gone. By the time he had nearly eliminated the pile on his desk, Naruto wasn't sure how much time had passed, but it must have been a lot since the sun was almost setting when there was a quick rapping noise on his door. It was the first time he had been disturbed all day, much to his surprise. Come in. The door opened, and Naruto looked up, raising an eyebrow when he saw his future father, Minato, enter the room. After exchanging greetings, the two of them simply stared at each other before the corner of Naruto's mouth started to twitch upwards. Is there something you wanted? Minato seemed hesitant to speak for some reason, but eventually shrugged and then rubbed the back of his neck as he chuckled, though it sounded half-hearted at best. Yeah, sorry. I was just wondering. Do you know what's up with Mikoto? Naruto immediately dropped the scroll in his hands onto his desk and stood up. What? What happened to her? The other blonde shook his head, now frowning outright, if not looking a little panicked. I don't know. I was hoping you did. Kushina and I were just getting ready to go get dinner as she showed up at Kushina's apartment. She looked like she was both furious and about to burst into tears, but wouldn't tell me anything, so I still don't know what happened. I'm just glad to see that you don't seem to be the cause. Naruto wasted no time in grabbing his vest from the back of his chair. The rest of the work he needed to do could wait until tomorrow. Well, I'm just as curious as you to find out what the cause is. Do you know where they are now? Minato looked to be ready to jump into action as much as Naruto did, but was quickly shaking his head to the negative. No idea. They have their spots where they go that I don't really bother looking for them. Hey, come on Minato. Haven't you been curious? Where's your sense of adventure? I'm curious but not stupid. Minato's voice was dripping with sarcasm. You haven't seen what Kushina does to those who piss her off. Naruto could only agree to that. It was likely from the stories he had heard and from what his mother told him briefly when he encountered her in Kurama's seal that anyone who crossed her would likely never be the same again. Fine, but as her friends, we should be worried for her, right? I think we can use that excuse in case Kushina starts waving her fist at us. I mean, I'd go ask Kagami-san, but I'd rather use him as a last resort. Besides, he may not know either. Minato actually stopped fidgeting and appeared to consider this for a moment before slowly agreeing. Fine. But if we get in any trouble, I'm blaming you. Naruto just shrugged and waved it off. If Kushina did get overly protective, hopefully Makoto would call her off. Whatever was going on, he didn't think he was the cause of it. He hoped not, anyway. Otherwise he might be visiting his grave earlier than expected. So have you plastered your seals all around the village yet? Only in the main places of the village. My usual training grounds, this building, my apartment, Kushina's place, Kushina gets one, but I don't. I see how it is. Minato just gave Naruto a dead stare, though the other blonde just chuckled and waved it off. Sheesh, can't take a joke? Come on, Databeo. I can appreciate jokes, I just don't think now is the time. Minato's lips were twitching upwards at the verbal tick, however. It was rather amusing for him how Kushina had become a lot more aware of her Tebane tick ever since Naruto showed up. Letting out a sigh, Naruto shook his head and held out his hand. You're right, sorry. It's just a defense mechanism for handling my worries. Pick a place, and we'll start from there. I understand. Grabbing Naruto's forearm, Minato made a seal with his free hand, and faster than he could blink, they were both transported to a spot just behind the check-in booth at the main gate. Releasing his arm, Minato looked around as Naruto stared at the entrance to the village. Construction traffic had slowed significantly by this time of the day. You think they went outside the village proper? Naruto gestured towards the entrance with his thumb. It's possible if they went to one of the training areas. How do you want to do this, anyway? Split up and meet back here in a half an hour? Naruto thought about that for barely a moment before shaking his head. I'll send out some shadow clones. They'll explore for a bit and report back to me. If they have no luck then we'll go. Minato gave him a skeptical look. Shadow clones? You know how much chakra they use, right? Of course I do. They're one of my main techniques. I haven't really had to use them much at all lately, though. Barely a second later nearly 20 clones appeared in a semicircle behind Naruto. He'd gotten so much practice using them that he didn't really even need to make the molding sign to create them anymore, nor did he have to announce his intentions to them. Without a word, they all immediately took off in different directions. Naruto simply stared at a speechless Minato, who was watching the clones with wonder. He'd purposefully avoided using them in spars with his future father so that he could get some good one-on-one combat experience. We'll give them about 15 minutes. If one of them dispels, I get the memories. If I get nothing from any of them, we'll use your plan. If we take too long they may just return to Kushina's or Makoto's place anyway. What Naruto didn't say was that some of the clones would use Sage Mode to pinpoint their locations. Searching for Kurama, who was still sealed within Kushina, would be a walk in the park. He still had some of the Bijuu's chakra sealed within him, and he figured that he could use that to resonate with the same chakra sealed in Kushina. He'd never used this particular method of searching before since this was a rather unique situation, so he hoped that she would just chalk it up to being a quirk of his sensor ability when searching for someone. At least before thinking it was weird and deserved to be looked into. Considering he didn't know what was wrong with Makoto, however, he was willing to risk Kushina finding out. He only heard Minato mumble something about that many clones before the other teen nodded and leaned back against a pole where he had placed the seal for his technique. Naruto had prepared for them to sit in silence for a bit but was surprised when Minato asked him a question he had not been expecting. Can you teach me that? I'll teach you this other technique I'm working on. Naruto had to bite his tongue, immediately wanting to brag that he already knew Hiraishin and Rasengan, but forcefully pushed it down and away. Sometimes he still had trouble separating the man who was his father from the 18-year-old in front of him. We'll have to ask the old man about it. Since it's in the Forbidden Scroll, I can't teach you anything in there without permission. There was a certain allure to making his father even more of a badass with shadow clones, though they didn't hold up too well using the Hiraishin. He knew from experience. Oh. Alright, that's fair. Naruto idly wondered if Minato was always so agreeable. If they hadn't died the day he was born, his mother probably would have worn the pants in their family. Or rather, she would, because he was making sure they both stuck around this time. The two of them stood around in silence for the rest of the time they waited, both agreeing not to jump to any conclusions regarding Mikoto until they had a better understanding of the situation. Barely a few minutes later, his clones had managed to isolate Kurama's suppressed signature and moved in closer to verify where Kushina and Mikoto were, by extension. They were at one of the more secluded training areas, sitting by a tree that was at the top of a decently sized hill. Found them. They're at one of the training grounds. 16, I think? It's outside the village behind the monument, near a few trees at the edge of a big hill. Minato looked surprised at first, then completely shocked as Naruto was able to pinpoint it so precisely. He opened his mouth, but Naruto continued talking and cut off anything he was going to say. I know you want me to tell you how I found them so quickly. All I can say is that it's classified right now. Other than being able to confirm that I am a type of censor, I may be able to tell you more soon. If not, you'll definitely find out the day you put on the big hat. The two just stared at each other for a few seconds, one incredulous, the other as if he was just speaking simple truths. Once again Minato managed to shake himself out of whatever stupor he was in and gestured for Naruto to lead the way. Nodding quickly, he took off to the rooftops, Minato right on his heels. Jumping quickly from rooftop to rooftop, then running up the side of the rock wall where the monument was, it didn't take long for them to arrive. As soon as they landed nearby, both Kushina and Mikoto jumped to their feet, getting ready for potential combat. Mikoto's stance was aggressively wary, while Kushina's arms relaxed the moment she laid eyes on both of them. Her posture still screamed stay back, however, so neither of the two males made any further steps towards the women. Minato. Naruto and Ikki. What? How did you find us? Naruto could see Minato pointing at him out of his peripheral, but resisted rolling his eyes and instead pointed at his own head and said, censor. Mikoto still hadn't moved, but Kushina relaxed a little more. I didn't know censors could pick out two specific chakra signatures amongst a densely populated village, and Ikki. Kushina-chan, I've already told you that both of your chakras feel different from everyone else. The redhead grimaced a bit, but nodded in acceptance. Kurama alone made her like a beacon to him when he used Sage Mode, even when he was sealed away like now. Her own individual chakra, however, was unique as well. It was hard to describe the difference, but it felt warmer. More vibrant. He claimed it was what Uzumaki chakra felt like, but since he had no way to sense other Uzumaki, he had no idea how much truth there was to it. She seemed to accept it without complaint, though, so he let it stay that way. He vaguely recalled Karen mentioning something like that to him back when she was being interrogated in his time, but didn't really pay much attention to it back then. As for why we're here, Naruto jabbed his finger at Minato this time. This guy came and dragged me out of my office, worried about Makoto-chan. Naruto listened with half an ear as Minato mumbled something about I don't drag, but tried to ignore it and continued speaking, so naturally I was worried as well, having just come back from a mission with a Makoto-chan who seemed to be in fairly good spirits. Part of me was genuinely worried while another part of me was wondering if I did something, and if I did, how much I would need to protect myself in the event I was to be struck by feminine vengeance. Kushina hid her mouth behind one of her hands, likely to keep from smiling outright as she looked back at Makoto. The raven-haired woman, meanwhile, had been watching Naruto talk and appeared amused as she looked down towards the grass and shook her head. If anyone was going to say anything further, they held off as they watched Makoto walk towards Naruto at a casual pace and stopped shortly in front of him. I was just getting ready to talk to Kushina about the contract, actually. Makoto closed her eyes and took a deep breath before reopening them and continuing. It's broken, she declared. Her words brought out in quiet huh? From Kushina, while Minato simply remained silent and looked back and forth between the other two. Did it all end okay? Makoto looked down at the ground again and sighed, yes, though for a little while it was. Difficult. Naruto hummed for a moment, watching the woman in front of him. She seemed to be opening up a little, though he had no idea what she and Kushina had discussed so far. From the way the redhead was looking, she had no idea what Makoto was talking about, but wasn't quite sure how to ask about it. So she was settling for watching them like a hawk instead. Minato was still standing there too, with his arms crossed over his chest. It was getting pretty dark out, but Minato's ice blue eyes seemed to be able to reflect what little light there was to the point they appeared to be glowing. He idly wondered if his own eyes did that. There were more important things to worry about right now though. Did you want to talk about it? Makoto looked into his eyes again, and a small smile twitched at the corners of her lips. That was a good sign. Yes, but I'd like a hug first. Naruto pretended to be affronted, placing a hand on his chest. What? You want a hug before you'll tell me anything? Blasphemy. His teasing was a good idea, as the twitching of her lips lifted into a full smile. Naruto acted as though that helped him to make up his mind quickly. Look at that smile. TCH, fine. You win. Get over here. As he opened his arms and grinned, Makoto nearly launched herself against him, though not nearly at the full speed she was capable of. He did have to take a slight step backwards to brace himself, but quickly recovered. As he felt her arms wrap around his waist, he mumbled into her ear, asking if she really was all right. I'm fine now. Anything else that may have been said between them was cut off as a squeal sounded behind Makoto, right about where Kushina was standing. Makoto ni. Naruto Iniki. In a flash. A red one, not yellow. She appeared next to them, her eyes wide. Both of you. Spill. Now. Makoto released Naruto first, stepping back slightly, and turned to look at her longtime friend. Naruto helped me break the contract I was in. Kushina raised a hand to her mouth again as she gasped, while Minato moved over a bit and continued the pseudo-interrogation. How did that happen? I mean, I knew you weren't into contracts and all that, but I didn't think an Uchiha contract could be broken. Makoto strongly shook her head negatively, her long ponytail whipping back and forth. There are ways it can be broken, but most of them revolve around death or something else bad happening. The easiest way was for me to have someone else's chakra residue in mine when I went to place my chakra in the seal I told you about. If it was an enemy's that would be one thing, but as it is the chakra of a fellow leaf nin who isn't a medic. As Makoto's voice trailed off, Minato's eyes widened, immediately understanding. Kushina, on the other hand, didn't look as though she quite understood. Apparently Makoto was used to explaining things of this manner, as she didn't even wait for the question to come before she started answering it. It means that we had to do a lot of kissing? So that his chakra would be absorbed into mine. Apparently Naruto has very strong chakra because it gave a reading like if we had. His chakra had completely melded with mine, pretty much over 90% of my body. She turned a curious eye to the blonde, who merely grinned and shrugged. Kushina was standing there, starry-eyed now as she looked between the two of them, while Minato was smiling in a more resigned way and rubbing at his forehead. Naruto was pretty sure that Makoto was likely blushing crimson by now, but it was dark enough that he couldn't really tell. He chuckled and tried to get some of the attention off of her. Sorry, it must have made it awkward for you. The strained smile that Makoto gave him immediately silenced any further laughter that would have escaped him and nearly made him regret his attempt. It was difficult for a little while. Fugaku said some things that I did not appreciate. I almost attacked him before my father stopped me and sent me to Kushina, saying he would take care of things. Naruto winced at that, but before he could say anything, Makoto grabbed his hand and gave it a squeeze. We can talk about it later. I don't want to dwell on it right now. I just want to spend time with my friends. Well, we can do that. Right, guys? Kushina quickly nodded and moved up to grab Makoto's other hand, sending questions about how it all happened at a mile a minute. Minato, on the other hand, moved over closer to Naruto's side while laying where Naruto and Makoto's hands were still connected. You do realize that I've known Makoto since I was 9, right? Naruto nodded, slowly. So she's like a sister to me in every way but blood. I don't know what's going on, but if you hurt her. Minato wasn't trying to look menacing, but he didn't have to. His voice conveyed enough. Before Naruto could agree or disagree. Not that he ever would. Makoto's voice cut in. While I appreciate it, I can handle myself, Minato. If there is anyone that I would rather you beat up, it is Fugaku. Just point me in the right direction, Kushina growled. She made a motion of rolling up imaginary sleeves and looking ready to kill. Makoto offered an unladylike snort and rolled her eyes, gave Naruto's hand another squeeze, and immediately turned her focus back to Kushina. None of us will be doing anything. My father will be handling it. If necessary, I will think up a suitable revenge later. Kushina didn't look happy at that announcement, if the pout on her face was any indication. However, she did grudgingly nod, accepting what Makoto said. Minato, on the other hand, simply looked relieved that Kushina wasn't going to go on a rampage. Now. I'm sorry I interrupted both of you earlier. You can go back to what you were doing. Thank you for coming with me, Kushina, even if we didn't talk for long. A small smile flickered across the redhead's face, but it didn't last long before concern took over. Are you sure you're going to be okay? I'm sure Minato wouldn't mind if you came to dinner with us tonight. Naruto glanced at Minato, curious to see what kind of response he would have to this, but the other blonde's face showed he was nothing but concerned for Makoto. Which made sense, considering they were Genin teammates. It's fine, thank you. I need to talk to Naruto about a few things anyway. Fine. Kushina waved one hand about, acting exasperated. I know when I'm not needed. But I will be hunting you down for details tomorrow, Makoto ni. Count on it. Makoto simply nodded, offering her best friend a little smile. Kushina grinned back, then grabbed Minato's arm and started forcefully dragging him away. He nearly stumbled, but quickly regained his balance and waved over his shoulder at the other two as he tried to keep pace with Kushina. Naruto waited until they were out of sight before saying anything. So. Do you want to talk about it, or would you rather go get dinner? We should probably talk first, so this way I can stop you without having to jump over a table, Makoto sighed. That bad, huh? He felt as Makoto squeezed his hand that she was still holding. Honestly, it wasn't that bad at all, at least not until the very end. Fugaku didn't seem surprised that I had broken the contract, which just made me sad and believe he was only interested in me for my position anyway. I gather that many of the clan in the same room were thinking the same thing. I'm guessing your council wasn't that pleased? Makoto snorted, a wry grin on her face. I would hardly call them a council, they're more like a bunch of old men that have nothing better to do now that they are retired. But no, they weren't pleased. Especially because my father did something similar when he wanted to marry my mother a little over 20 years ago. The grocery lady, right? He mentioned her. Yes, the grocery lady, Makoto chuckled slightly and moved closer to Naruto, wrapping her arm around his and pressing their sides together. Thanks to that, most of them immediately blamed my father for it and are afraid that it has now started a precedent. Naruto hummed out a response, thinking it best to just let her talk for now. She must have appreciated it because as Makoto continued to speak, she moved to grab one of his arms, pinning his bicep against her chest as they stood nearly shoulder to shoulder while looking at each other. They were just about the same height, so when Naruto had turned his head to look at her, he found himself staring right into her dark eyes. Fugaku was one of the first to leave. As he passed me, he said he felt shame for our clan, that the heir was so desperate she had to whore herself out to one of the Hokage's stooges. Naruto's first instinct was to storm off and go show Fugaku a thing or two about being a gentleman through the use of several pointy objects, but when trying to move it quickly became apparent that he wouldn't be going anywhere. At least not without Makoto, or if he was willing to lose an arm. She was holding onto his arm from before rather fiercely now, and the way she was just staring at him led him to believe he wasn't going to be going anywhere. She already knew that what she said would set him off. It didn't take long for him to calm down after that. Are you sure you don't have the Sharingan already? Makoto's voice was a whisper. Certain. Why? Your eyes flashed red for a moment there. It just made me wonder. As if he was trying to hide it after the fact, he closed his eyes and looked down. It's one of my special abilities. I'll tell you soon. I promise. Makoto didn't look too happy at first, but then slowly nodded. She still didn't release his arm, though. I'm guessing you were planning on doing something about Fugaku? His eyes opened again, looking at her. Yes. Don't, Makoto sighed. My father and his advisors will take care of him for saying what he shouldn't. Naruto couldn't help but frown. I don't like it. But if that's what you want. It is. Thank you for coming to my defense, though. The grip on his arm eased slightly, but not by much. The blonde felt his anger start to ebb away as he tried to put it out of his mind. He wouldn't forget, but he could ignore it. For now. Feeling a twinge in his stomach, he placed his free hand over it. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm hungry. I was stuck in my office all day and I wanted to get everything done before I ate. His current companion nodded slightly, giving him a small smile. I am too, now that you mention it. Want to stop by a restaurant? Mikoto hummed for a second, then shook her head. No, just something simple and filling would suffice. It's been a long day and I don't feel like going home to get changed. Sounds good. A grin began to crawl over Naruto's face. Hey, I know Kushina might have already dragged you there before, but there is this up-and-coming stand which serves ramen that is to die for. End of chapter 11.